The camera. Looks like a camera. I was sitting in my room, and then my dad was just yelling, just screaming at my mom. And then I heard a gunshot. I ran out there, and my mom had been shot. He pointed the gun at me. And then he said he was sorry, and then he shot himself.
Is there anything you want to tell me? We all know what happened, okay? The scene talks for itself, okay?
Is there any reason why they think I'm a suspect? I love my mom and dad.
What's going on?
I don't know what happened. I just came over to my parents' house because we were going to watch the game. And, my mom is shot and my dad is shot and my brother's here.
Does anybody know what happened?
I don't know. I think so.
My mom and he shot himself. And then he shot my mom. My dad shot my mom. All right, have a seat in the car.
Officer,
Yes,
did my dad die?
I have no idea what's going on. The county units are gonna come down here and they'll ask you questions, okay?
I don't have a record.
Okay.
How long is this gonna take?
One of the things that strikes me is the rapid nature of his shift of mood. So it kind of goes into what we call shallow affect, or the shallowness of the emotional expression.
This is bizarre. What this behavior is sussing out or exploring what do the police know so that he will then know what to expect and how to angle what he's going to do next.
Well, my dad's the pastor at the church of the church right near here. Lord, please don't let my dad die. Please don't let my dad die, Lord. Please don't let my dad die. Please, Lord, don't let my dad die.
Daniel's appeal to God can be seen as kind of an attempt to be seen positively. If people view him as a spiritual religious figure, they might be more forgiving of his sins. It's an attempt at manipulation.
This is a continuation of the performance. He's really quite sharp about what he's doing. I think it could be a genuine expression of hope that maybe his dad doesn't die, but I don't think so.
Okay. First one is Daniel. How about your date of birth?
I'm 16.
What grade are you in?
I'm a junior.
And whose house were you headed over to when you guys stopped?
I called my friend Steve and told him what happened.
What did you tell Steve happened?
That my dad had shot my mom and then shot himself. And he thought I was joking at first, just kind of laughed about it, but then I told him I was serious and it wasn't a joke. And he told me he'd meet up with me.
Okay. When your sister came in the door, What happened then?
She came to the door, and I opened the door, and I was standing there, and she asked me what was wrong. And I didn't want her to see it. And she walked in and saw it and started screaming. Can I call my sister? Am I allowed to call my sister and see how my dad's doing? We'll see.
Anybody touch the gun?
I picked up the gun
You picked up the gun?
and set it over on the other chair. And I realized that he wasn't dead and he might try and do something to himself again. So I moved him.
What he's doing here is very calculated. He is providing a reason that might explain why his fingerprints will be found on the gun. And he makes it even sound like it was a gesture of kindness. But no, he's plotting an alibi.
I've been against bowling tonight. No. What about? Do you think they'll go to the World Series? You a Boston fan? Don't think they ever did.
It's just this absolute indifference to the whole situation he's in. He is entirely self-absorbed, and there's no emotional involvement in this tragedy he's supposed to be experiencing.
You said you had been grounded. How long have you been grounded for?
A month?
That's because you snuck out of the house. Where'd you guys go?
We went up to the mall. There was a new game coming out.
Is that your Halo game in the van?
It's like an alien invasion game. It was being released at midnight, and we're being there to get the game at midnight.
When did your parents find out that you had snuck out to go get this game?
I came back in the house and I was playing in the basement, and my mom woke up and came down there. Yeah, it was probably 1:30 in the morning. She knew it was coming out at midnight. She woke my dad up and they just said I was grounded and that I was just gonna be grounded for a while until they said I was ungrounded. My parents just said they were disappointed in me that I would do something like that.
The video game is not what's significant. What's significant is his parents, in his perception, are intentionally and motivated to prevent him from reaching a goal. And that is what increases the level of anger and subsequent aggression.
The video game is definitely a fantasy world. This is absorbing to him. This is his world. Invasion narratives are about the other that's coming in either to threaten or take over or something, and you get to fight back and ward them off and overcome and win. So this is about power.
I had asked them if I could go out to the movies with a friend tonight. That's why my parents were arguing. And so I was sitting in my room, and then my dad was just yelling, just screaming at my mom. And then I heard a gunshot.
How did you do that?
Oh, I ran out there, and my mom had been shot. He pointed the gun at me. Then he said he was sorry, and then he shot himself.
I don't buy it at all. This is the story he's decided he's going to tell. He's trying to sound emotionally upset, well, kind of half covering his face for it. But what the dynamic he's setting up is that he is a victim in all of this. We see him attributing to the father his own aggression and blaming the father because he resents his father. I think the emotion and the story are absolutely calculated. This is his alibi.
Is there any reason why they think I'm a suspect? Is it probably because I got in the car and left? I hope my dad's all right. The only thing is, my dad's all right, he's gonna go to jail.
Is there anything you want to tell me? I mean, we all know what happened, okay? The scene talks for itself, okay? So we know what happened. I don't know why it happened. That's what I'm trying to find out now, is why it happened.
No, I don't feel like talking. I just need to gather my thoughts for a second. You know, like, basically, like what kind of sentencing has been dealt out?
Well,
Like what I'm looking at?
yes. What do you think should be a suitable punishment?
I don't know. Will I be charged as an adult?
I can't say, because that's not up to me right now, all right?
Because I am a juvenile.
His change in body language is very interesting. He has his left hand toward his brow to indicate that he's crying, looking with his left eye to see what the detective is doing.
There's the element of psychopathy. Someone who apparently doesn't really have empathy. It looks like he is angling and conniving and planning and checking out what he needs to say and what he won't say so he can figure out what will be best for him.
You getting paid overtime for this?
Not till 11.
Do you usually work this late? Like, what are your hours?
3 to 11.
3 p.m. to 11? Those are good hours.
Single life.
You get to stay up late and sleep in. It's good hours. Oh my gosh.
So people who are psychopaths, they can put on a mask and appear as normal as possible to other people. He doesn't care about the police officers, but he is probing. What's clear, no matter what we read into his specific comments, is that he is not behaving like a normal person. He's not having the basic emotions of fear, anxiety, loss, and concern about family.
So, did you get the gun out of the top of the dresser?
I just don't feel like talking.
Do you know who got shot first?
It's almost kind of like I blacked out for a minute.
Do you remember how many times you shot the gun? Do you remember where your dad was at when you shot the gun?
Honestly, not really. I don't remember much.
When you say not really, what do you remember of that?
It's just that I get real angry. And it's kind of just, but I don't really know.
Okay.
It wasn't something I really thought about.
Mr. Peter, you shoot your wife. No. Mr. Peter, you Daniel shoot. Was there an argument earlier that day between the three of you? Did Daniel do this to you, Susan? Mark, I want to thank you for your time. You're a strong person.
Well, at this point right now, it's going to be murder. Okay? So why don't you go ahead and tell me now what happened? Let's just be done with this. Get it out. Let me tell your side of it.
My parents were arguing, and eventually it came down to, they said they were going to get a divorce. I just kind of snapped.
He's trying to think of reasons. I've spun the religious reason. I've spun the I don't know what happened reason. I've spun my father did this reason. I think we're on the 6th different narrative at this point. But he did not snap. The literature and the science has been very, very clear that people don't snap. If you scratch below the surface in many of these instances, there are many clues. Long-term anger, possible depression, inconsistency within parents, high control, low empathy. There's always signs.
Reverend Mark Petrick takes the stand in the trial of his 17-year-old son, Daniel. Prosecutors say in October of last year, the teenager shot his father and shot and killed his mother, Sue Petrick, in the living room of their Wellington home.
He said, "Would you guys close your eyes? I have a surprise for you."
The line that the father tells us, I think there is an element of sadistic pleasure in doing it. It does come within the context of an adolescent who, I suspect for a while, has felt enraged living in the home under the rules from the parents.
Mark Petrick of Wellington believes his son's addiction to a violent video game is what caused him to shoot both his parents after they took the game away.
He got involved in the violent graphic video games and became addicted to them and was playing as much as 18 hours a day.
He decided to kill both of them and to make it look like a murder-suicide. Daniel has serious problems telling the truth. Daniel knows how to manipulate. His brain really works.
If you're growing up in a household where you realize the rules are very strict, it can produce a sort of split sense in kids growing up. Some children may discover they have to be duplicitous. You have to be able to say yes to get along with everybody because those are the rules, while then secretly doing something else. Where this can then move into the psychotic.
Like a mind game with me, that's where I got my kicks, I guess. This is, yeah, this is gonna be a shock to a lot of people. I heard.
Bill and Lorraine Currier vanished from their Essex home.
The couple's garage window was broken, and the phone line to the home had been cut. Police say they do have evidence the couple was abducted.
Why did you pick these folks?
I didn't. It was just random. I'm willing to talk about the rest of it If I get a cigar.
Working the night shift and was scheduled to close around 8 p.m. Police say they believe a stranger took Koenig and now need your help finding her.
I don't know if my daughter's being fed, taken care of, if she's still alive, if she's getting any sleep. Just please help find my daughter.
Federal prosecutors say 34-year-old Israel Keys, an Army veteran and self-employed contractor, stole a debit card from the coffeehouse worker.
Morning, Israel. Morning. How you doing? See how it is, all right?
I'm not in this for the glory. I'm not in this for media attention. I give you information.
If I feel like things don't work out at any point, then obviously, then I'm not going to be giving you more information. My concern, the problem is nowadays, the more stuff my name is attached to, the more likely it is that somebody's going to try to do some kind of stupid frickin' TV special, or you know how it is nowadays, like with all this true crime that people are obsessed with.
He says he doesn't want a crime TV show, but everything about the things he says are very provocative and very, I think he would want a crime TV show. I think in his narcissism.
He clearly knows that he has, in part, an upper hand. He's playing cat and mouse in the interview. He's being in charge. He's leading the interview.
Anchorage was, I knew better. I was telling myself the whole time I was doing it, it was a bad idea. You don't do things near where you live.
Israel Keys entered the Common Ground coffee kiosk just a few minutes before 8 o'clock closing. He found Samantha Koenig inside the kiosk. In the shed is where he sexually assaulted and killed Samantha Koenig.
Keys then dismembered her body and dumped her remains in Matanuska Lake.
I've known since I was 14 that there were things that that I thought were normal and that were okay that nobody else seems to think are normal and okay. Yeah. When I was 14, and there was a cat of ours that was always getting into the trash. And so there was this kid, and we all went up into the woods, and I had the cat with me. And took a piece of parachute cord and tied it to this tree. And I had a .22 revolver with me. And that was pretty much the last time anybody went in the woods with me.
It almost sounds like he's bragging. He definitely got a kick out of the effect this had on his friends. I'm sure he scared them and horrified them. And I'm sure that was as much a source of pleasure as killing the cat, if not more.
I'm
many other of these weapons caches do you have?
If I tell you that, I'll never be able to use them again.
I thought you told us you'd gone ahead and resign yourself to that, huh?
I don't know, maybe the apocalypse will hit. Come on, everybody loves buried treasure.
Yeah.
I think what's particularly frightening about Keyes is how impersonal his killing is. He's cunning, manipulative, deceitful, hiding his tracks.
He was a planner. He knew what it would take. He has a full fantasy in his head. He was prepared. This is an individual who knew what he liked, knew the tools that he would need to be able to get the satisfaction he'd like.
I'm not going to talk about those things that I know you're eventually going to connect me to unless I know that I'm going to get what I want. I want an execution date. I want this whole thing done in a year.
I thought that was the ultimate way he was going to exert control. He wanted to make sure he could determine how his life was going to end because he wasn't going to end up living in prison for years.
Trying to negotiate and hold back information he had, as a bargaining chip. I think he's a poster boy for a psychopath. There's really little question about it.
Tell me how we can start.
I'll give you 2 bodies and a name. All right. I'll give you 2 bodies and a name. But I'm not going to give you the rest.
Can you give us an idea of what region?
Burlington, Vermont. I fished there for a couple days while I was in that hotel. And that's when I took them.
And who were we looking for?
Last name, Currier, Currier.
First name?
I don't remember their first names. There's a couple.
Authorities say 49-year-old Bill Currier and his wife, 55-year-old Lorraine Currier, have been missing from their Vermont home for nearly a week now.
We're devastated by their disappearance and in fear for their lives.
It's a big mystery to them at this point, I think.
Right.
All I can say is that unless I talk about it, you're never going to find any evidence.
You can see it in some of his amusement when they're frustrated. You can see he's actually just enjoying it. That's what makes him scary, I think.
So for them, it was a mystery.
I mean, like I say, I'll tell you blow by blow. I know you've talked about closure and things like that, but I don't see it from that point of view. What's done is done. I'm just saying, I know that, you have pressure on you to find these other people, but frankly, they'll keep. I don't feel the same moral obligation. I guess, obviously I don't think in those terms that a lot of people do, so.
He is saying, we're operating on 2 different principles here. You're operating on the principle that how people feel matters. He's saying, I'm not that kind of an animal.
As far as the Curriers, you told me that it was random, how you picked them out. There wasn't a reason.
Well, it was, I didn't know them.
I started walking around town at about 8 or 9 o'clock after it got dark. I decided I was gonna look for a house with a couple in it. And then I found that house, and it was exactly what I was looking for. I decided I was gonna look for a house with a couple in it. I cut the phone lines as soon as I picked the house because usually if there's an alarm system, it'll trigger the alarm. I had my headlamp on. I was probably in the bedroom within 5 or 6 seconds from the time the glass broke. People never expect this stuff to happen.
Do you remember what you told him?
It was like a blitz attack. You just make sure they know right away who's in charge. Got their hands and their feet together with cable ties. They started trying to talk to me and stuff. And
you try to personalize it?
Yeah. And I would go along with it a little bit.
What'd you tell them?
I just told them a story that I thought was somewhat believable so they wouldn't freak out.
When you go into the woods with a gun, you know, you don't give much thought to what the deer might be thinking or the rabbit. And that's how he's looking at these people.
Israel Keys used his own manipulative tendencies actually to make the husband think that he actually cared.
The plan was I was gonna rape her and, you know, he was gonna be involved too. My plan was to take him into the basement, tie him up separate, and then take her upstairs.
He, you know, had these plans for how that would play out, including, it sounds like, having the husband witness some of the torture that he was going to impose upon the wife.
He likes having power. That's what a lot of psychopaths are about anyway. It's all about power and asserting one's self as the arbiter of life and death.
Walked him down there and cable tied his hands down to the stool so he couldn't stand up. Well, I mean, it must have taken me longer than I thought because I came out of the basement and she was standing right there by the car. She had somehow broke the cable ties on her hands and on her feet and got out of the car. She was almost to the road. She was almost to the road when I came out of the basement. And she saw me come out, she started running, and I tackled her on the lawn and roughed her up a little bit and tied her back up. He was kind of a big guy, like overweight, and the stool had just collapsed. And I guess when it collapsed, the cable ties that I had on his wrist behind his back, they had broke. I just messed my whole plan up. So I was kind of pissed off about that, and I was like, just let us go. And I just kind of laughed at him. I was like, you don't even know how much planning I've put into this, and just walk away.
They're just objects. They are toys for his mind to complete a fantasy that he's planned. All of those human appeals, they make no difference.
I had this idea in my head of what was gonna happen, and she was screwing it up. And he started to say something, and it just pissed me off, and I just started pulling the trigger. I was surprised, like, how fast he went down us.
People sometimes think, okay, a serial killer doesn't have feelings. Oh, they have emotions. They have feelings. You'll see the emotions when they realize someone is thwarting them. And then you see this explosion of rage. I don't think he'd intended to shoot him so quickly because he wanted to take him upstairs and follow the play, right? But he's thrown off his plan by an intense emotion of frustration.
I had her tied up a couple different ways, and I guess you could call it like the fantasy that developed over the years. It seems like I got more into the tying up part, and I'm not sure why really, but yeah, that was a big, that was a good one. I had everything on that one.
He is truly deriving pleasure from the distress of another person. He's anticipating the horrified response by someone else, and I think finds that exciting. This is what makes him a very different and very dangerous individual.
I've just been thinking that hypothetically, best route for me to give you all the information you need might be kind of like a last minute kind of thing. So I'm not around for the aftermath.
Well, do you think that's realistic?
Do I think it's realistic? I don't know. It seems to me like that would kind of be my call. Whether or not it's realistic.
On Sunday morning, serial killer Israel Keys was found dead at the Anchorage Correctional Complex.
Federal inmate Israel Keys was found dead in his jail cell of an apparent suicide.
Now these potential victims will never know. Their families will never have closure. And by committing suicide, he says to the world,
September 15th, 2007. The giant station clock hung over the crowd like a silent witness. People moved beneath it in steady currents. Travelers dragging suitcases. Office workers hurrying toward platforms. Families gathering around coffee stands. The noise blended into a familiar urban rhythm, the screech of train brakes, rolling luggage wheels rattling over polished floors, fragments of conversations disappearing into the cavernous ceiling of Southern Cross Station in Melbourne. No one noticed the little girl at first. She stood near a wall, small enough to disappear among the legs of passing strangers. 3 years old. Dark hair. Round cheeks. A pink jacket. She wasn't crying. Not yet. She simply stood there clutching a tiny bag, her eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for a familiar face that had vanished only moments before. Thousands of people passed her. No one knew her name. No one knew where she came from. No one knew that somewhere across the Tasman Sea, her mother's body was already beginning to decompose in the trunk of a family car. And no one knew that the man who had brought her here, the one person she trusted more than anyone in the world, had already walked away. Forever. The little girl waited. Children believe their parents always come back. A parent disappears into a store. A parent steps around a corner. A parent walks toward a ticket machine. Then they return. That is how the world works when you are 3 years old. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. The crowds continued flowing around her like water around a stone. Eventually someone noticed. A station employee. Then another. Questions were asked. Where are your parents? What is your name? Who are you waiting for? The little girl could not explain. Her answers came in fragments. A mixture of confusion and fear. She was too young to understand what had happened. Too young to understand that her entire life had just been shattered. Authorities would later give her a temporary name. Pumpkin. Not because that was who she was. Because it was the word printed on the clothing she wore. Imagine that for a moment. A child so completely disconnected from her identity that investigators had to borrow a name from a clothing label. Pumpkin. The name spread quickly across Australian news broadcasts. Viewers saw photographs of a lonely little girl with large dark eyes. A mystery child. An abandoned child. A child whose father seemed to have vanished into thin air. What nobody realized at the time was that this story was far darker than abandonment. Far darker than custody disputes. Far darker than a missing parent. Because while television stations showed images of a confused little girl waiting for someone who would never return, another investigation was quietly beginning hundreds of miles away. A woman was missing. Her name was Annie Liu. 28 years old. Mother. Daughter. Immigrant. Wife. Friends had not heard from her. Family members were growing increasingly concerned. The silence surrounding her life felt wrong. Not unusual. Wrong. There is a difference. People become busy. Phones die. Plans change. But loved ones know when silence carries weight. They feel it. Like pressure in the air before a storm. Annie's family felt that pressure. And it was growing heavier by the day. What they didn't know was that Annie would never answer another phone call. Never send another message. Never tuck her daughter into bed again. Never celebrate another birthday. Because by the time concerns were being raised, Annie Liu was already dead. Her body lay hidden inside the trunk of a silver family vehicle. Only a short distance from the house where she had once lived. Only a short distance from the toys her daughter had played with. Only a short distance from photographs that still showed smiling faces. A home that should have been filled with ordinary family memories had become the center of a nightmare. Yet the nightmare stretched far beyond one house. Far beyond one city. Far beyond one country. Within weeks, police agencies in New Zealand, Australia, and the United States would become entangled in one of the most disturbing international manhunts of the decade. At the center stood a man named Nai Yin Shui. To some people he appeared quiet. Reserved. Successful. A businessman. A husband. A father. But appearances can be deceptive. Sometimes the most dangerous stories begin not with monsters hiding in darkness. They begin with ordinary people living behind ordinary doors. A suburban street. A family car. A smiling photograph. A wedding album gathering dust on a shelf. Nothing announces the tragedy. Nothing warns the neighbors. Nothing signals the approaching disaster. Then one day everything changes. And afterward, everyone looks back searching for signs they missed. That would happen here. Again and again. Because as investigators peeled back the layers of this case, they discovered a relationship scarred by fear, control, intimidation, and violence. A marriage that had been deteriorating behind closed doors. A woman trying to find safety. A man determined to maintain control. The details would emerge slowly. Painfully. Each revelation darker than the last. But in September 2007, those details were still hidden. All investigators had were questions. Who was the abandoned child? Where was her mother? Why had her father disappeared? And perhaps most chilling of all, what had happened during the final moments before everything unraveled? The answers would lead police across oceans, across continents, across thousands of miles. They would involve international warrants, media campaigns, public sightings, false leads. and one of the most recognizable fugitives in the world at that moment. For months, Na Yin Xue seemed to exist like a ghost. Photographs of his face appeared everywhere. Television broadcasts, newspapers, internet forums, airport alerts, police bulletins. People stared at his image wondering where he might be hiding. Meanwhile, a little girl remained trapped in a reality she could not yet comprehend. She had lost both parents. One to murder. One to his own choices. Yet perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this case is that its central victim could never tell investigators what she witnessed. 3 years old. Too young to provide a timeline. Too young to explain conversations. Too young to describe warning signs. Too young to understand the horror unfolding around her. Children often become silent witnesses to adult violence. Present but unseen. Watching events they cannot interpret. Remembering fragments they cannot explain. In this case, the only person who may have been present during the family's final days was a child who lacked the words to describe what she had experienced. That silence would haunt the investigation. Because hidden somewhere within those missing days lay the truth. A truth buried beneath lies. Buried beneath deception. Buried beneath a carefully constructed escape plan. And at the center of it all was a question that would echo from Auckland to Melbourne to Atlanta. How does a father walk away from his own child? To understand that question, we have to travel backward. Before the station. Before the headlines. Before the international manhunt. Before the abandoned little girl known only as Pumpkin. We have to return to a different place. A different time. To a marriage that looked ordinary from the outside. To a family whose future still appeared intact. To moments that seemed insignificant at the time but would later take on terrifying meaning. Because tragedies rarely begin on the day a body is discovered. They begin long before that. In arguments no one else hears. In fears no one else sees. In choices that appear small until they accumulate into catastrophe. Somewhere in those hidden years, the ending of this story was already taking shape. No one knew it. Not the neighbors. Not the friends. Not the little girl. And perhaps not even Annie Liu herself. But the countdown had already begun. Toward a house in Auckland. Toward a silent trunk. Toward an abandoned child standing alone beneath the fluorescent lights of a train station. Toward a crime that would shock 3 nations. And toward a question that remains deeply unsettling even today. What happened inside that family before everything fell apart? This is the story of Annie Liu. The story of Na Yin Xue. The story of a little girl the world came to know as Pumpkin. And the story of a murder that crossed oceans before justice finally caught up. Long before the headlines, before the photographs of an abandoned child appeared on television screens across Australia, before police officers stood around a silver vehicle in Auckland trying to make sense of a terrible discovery, there was a life that looked, from a distance, almost ordinary. The story begins thousands of miles away from the station where a little girl would one day stand alone. It begins with ambition. With migration. With dreams powerful enough to carry people across oceans. In the early years of the 21st century, New Zealand had become home to a growing immigrant community. Families arrived from different corners of the world carrying suitcases filled with belongings and hearts filled with expectations. They came searching for opportunity, stability, and a future that seemed impossible elsewhere. Auckland was often the first chapter of that future. Spread between sparkling harbours and rolling green suburbs, the city projected an image of calm prosperity. Ferries crossed blue waters. Cafes buzzed with conversation. Families filled parks on weekends. To newcomers, Auckland represented possibility. But like every city, it possessed 2 realities. There was the version visible from postcards and tourist brochures. And there was the version hidden behind closed doors. The version where relationships fractured. Where financial pressures accumulated. Where isolation quietly grew. Where violence could exist unnoticed only a few meters away from ordinary suburban life. Mount Roskill sat within this landscape. A residential area where rows of modest homes lined quiet streets. Children rode bicycles along sidewalks. Neighbors exchanged polite greetings. Cars returned to driveways every evening after work. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested that it would someday become associated with one of the country's most notorious criminal cases. On the surface, it was simply another suburb. The kind of place where people expected normal lives to unfold. The kind of place where terrible things seemed unlikely. Among the residents living there was a family that appeared, at least from the outside, to be building exactly the life many immigrants hoped to achieve. Nai Yin Shwe had come to New Zealand carrying significant ambitions. He was often described as intelligent and business-minded. The image he projected suggested confidence, success, control. People who encountered him casually might have seen a man determined to establish himself in a new country. Someone working toward prosperity. Someone focused on achievement. The story he presented to the world was one of advancement, of progress, of opportunity. And for a time, that image appeared convincing. Alongside him was his wife, Annie Liu. Young, educated, hopeful. Like many immigrants adapting to life in a foreign country, she faced the challenge of balancing two worlds. The culture she came from, and the culture she was building around her. The process can be exhilarating. It can also be lonely. Every immigrant understands this tension. The excitement of possibility exists alongside the ache of distance. Parents remain far away. Childhood friends become voices on a telephone line. Familiar traditions are suddenly separated by thousands of miles. You build a new life while simultaneously mourning pieces of the old one. For Annie, that balancing act was part of everyday existence. Then came another major change. Motherhood. The birth of her daughter transformed the rhythm of life. Children alter everything. Sleep schedules disappear. Priorities shift. Future plans become centered around someone else. Every decision begins to include another tiny human being. For Annie, that child became the center of her world. Her daughter, Qian Zun Shwe. The little girl who would later become known internationally as Pumpkin. At that stage, however, she was simply a beloved child. A daughter learning to walk. Learning to speak. Learning to navigate a world that felt safe because her parents occupied it. Family photographs from those years show moments frozen in time. Smiles. Celebrations. Gatherings. The kind of images found in countless homes. The kind of images people look at years later and struggle to reconcile with tragedy. Because photographs rarely reveal the full story. A camera captures appearances. Not tensions. Not fear. Not arguments that happen after guests leave. Not the silence that follows conflict. Not the emotional fractures spreading beneath a relationship's surface. Those details remain invisible. At least initially. As the years passed, signs began emerging that all was not well within the marriage. The exact timeline of deterioration remains difficult to reconstruct perfectly. Relationships rarely collapse in a straight line. Instead, they erode gradually. Small incidents become larger ones. Disagreements become patterns. Patterns become routines. Eventually people find themselves living inside circumstances they would never have accepted at the beginning. Investigators later uncovered evidence suggesting Annie's marriage had become increasingly troubled. Control appeared to play a significant role. Control over decisions. Control over finances. Control over daily life. Control is a word often associated with abusive relationships, but its reality is frequently subtle at first. It may begin with criticism disguised as concern. Restrictions disguised as protection. Monitoring disguised as love. By the time victims recognize what is happening, the boundaries of normal behavior have often shifted dramatically. What once seemed unacceptable begins to feel unavoidable. The psychological impact can be profound. Isolation grows. Confidence diminishes. Fear develops quietly. Not through a single dramatic event, but through repeated experiences that teach someone the cost of resistance. People on the outside often ask a question whenever stories like this emerge. Why didn't she leave? The question appears simple. The answer never is. Leaving an abusive relationship is frequently one of the most dangerous moments in a victim's life. It involves uncertainty, financial concerns, family pressures, emotional manipulation, threats, children, fear, hope that things might improve, hope that the person they once loved still exists somewhere beneath the anger. Victims often carry all these burdens simultaneously. Annie's circumstances reflected many of those realities. Behind the appearance of family life, tensions continued to grow. Friends and relatives would later describe concerns, warnings, moments that seemed troubling even before the crime occurred. As investigators pieced together the story, a pattern gradually emerged. A pattern suggesting that Annie had become increasingly fearful, increasingly aware that her marriage was moving toward a dangerous place. Yet life continued. Because life almost always continues until the moment it doesn't. Mornings arrived. Meals were prepared. Bills were paid. School plans were discussed. Groceries were purchased. Children laughed. The ordinary routines of existence persisted. And perhaps that is what makes cases like this so haunting. The coexistence of normality and catastrophe. A family can sit around a dinner table while a crisis quietly grows beneath every conversation. Neighbors can wave from across a fence without realizing they are witnessing the final months of someone's life. The future often announces itself in whispers, rarely in alarms. By 2007, however, the atmosphere surrounding the family appeared increasingly strained. Financial difficulties reportedly added pressure. Business concerns created stress. Relationship problems intensified. The combination formed a volatile environment. One that would eventually explode. Yet nobody standing outside the family home could have predicted exactly how devastating the outcome would become. If someone had driven through Mount Roskill during those final months, they would have seen ordinary streets beneath changing skies. Children returning home from school. Garden fences. Parked cars. Streetlights illuminating quiet roads after sunset. Nothing visibly extraordinary. Nothing suggesting an international manhunt was approaching. Nothing suggesting a young mother's life was nearing its end. Nothing suggesting a 3-year-old child would soon become the focus of worldwide media attention. The contrast is unsettling. History often remembers major crimes through dramatic images. Police tape. Courtrooms. News helicopters. But before those images exist, there is usually a period of deceptive calm. A period where everything appears manageable. Recoverable. Temporary. The setting of this story exists inside that calm. Auckland in 2007. A suburban neighborhood. An immigrant family. A marriage under strain. A little girl too young to understand the tensions surrounding her. And a future moving steadily toward disaster. As September approached, the distance between appearance and reality was becoming increasingly dangerous. From the outside, the family still existed. Inside the home, however, unseen pressures continued building. Every argument left residue. Every threat altered the emotional landscape. Every conflict pushed the relationship closer to a breaking point. No one knew how close that point had become. Not the neighbors. Not the commuters traveling through Melbourne days later. Not the journalists who would eventually cover the case. And certainly not the little girl whose life would soon change forever. The stage was set. The players were already in position. The environment that would produce tragedy had been forming for years. All that remained was the event that would transform private suffering into international news. The event that would reveal what had been hidden behind the walls of an ordinary family home. And when that moment finally arrived, its consequences would stretch across 3 countries, leaving behind questions, grief, and a child standing alone in a crowded station, waiting for someone who was never coming back. Before she became a headline, before detectives studied photographs of her face and prosecutors spoke her name inside a courtroom, Annie Liu was simply a young woman trying to build a life. That is often the tragedy hidden beneath true crime stories. The public remembers the crime. The victim's family remembers the person. And those are not the same thing. When news reports eventually covered the case, Annie's life was compressed into a few short descriptions. A wife. A mother. A murder victim. But a human life is never that small. It is made of thousands of ordinary moments. Morning routines. Private dreams. Childhood memories. Inside jokes shared with friends. Future plans scribbled onto pieces of paper. Favorite songs. Favorite foods. The things that make someone irreplaceable. To understand the loss at the center of this story, we need to step away from the crime scene for a moment. We need to meet Annie before fear entered the picture. Before police reports. Before court proceedings. Before tragedy. Like many young people seeking opportunity beyond the place where they were born, Annie belonged to a generation willing to cross borders in pursuit of a better future. Immigration is often described through statistics. Numbers. Population growth. Economic reports. But every immigration story begins with an individual decision. A moment when someone looks at the life they have and imagines the life they might create somewhere else. That decision requires courage. It requires optimism. And perhaps most importantly, it requires belief. Belief that tomorrow can be different from today. People who knew Annie often described her as hardworking, determined, focused on family. Those qualities rarely generate headlines, yet they define countless lives. The world is built by ordinary people carrying responsibilities that nobody celebrates. Parents working long hours. Immigrants adapting to unfamiliar cultures. Mothers sacrificing sleep, comfort, and personal ambitions to care for children. Annie belonged to that world. The quiet world. The world where love is demonstrated through effort rather than words. When she became a mother, much of her attention shifted toward her daughter. Like countless parents, she began measuring time differently. Days revolved around feeding schedules. Bedtime routines. Doctor appointments. The tiny milestones children achieve without realizing how much they mean. A first word. A first sentence. A first independent step. The things adults remember forever. For Annie, her daughter represented possibility. The future. A reason to keep moving forward even during difficult periods. Anyone who has spent time around young children understands how completely they transform a household. Toys appear in every room. Tiny shoes gather beside doors. Drawings decorate refrigerators. The entire home begins to orbit around someone who weighs less than 20 kilograms. Every parent knows the feeling. You glance into a room. The child is there. And suddenly everything feels right. For Annie, those moments mattered. Because motherhood was not merely a role. It was part of her identity. Part of the life she was building. Part of the future she imagined. But while her relationship with her daughter deepened, her marriage appeared to be moving in a different direction. People often imagine abusive relationships as constant chaos. Endless shouting. Visible bruises. Doors slamming every night. The reality is usually far more complicated. Many abusive relationships contain periods of calm. Periods of affection. Periods where victims convince themselves things might improve. Then the cycle begins again. Tension builds. Conflict erupts. Promises are made. Temporary peace follows. Then the pattern repeats. Over time, the cycle can become emotionally exhausting. Victims begin adapting to survive it. They monitor moods. Avoid certain topics. Modify behavior. Walk carefully through conversations. Not because they want to. Because they believe it is necessary. Investigators later uncovered evidence suggesting Annie's marriage had become increasingly dominated by control and intimidation. The details revealed a relationship that appeared deeply unhealthy. Friends and relatives would later describe concerns that had existed long before the murder. Looking backward, some remembered warning signs. Moments that seemed troubling. Comments that felt wrong. Behaviors that now appeared more significant. This is common after tragedy. People revisit memories searching for clues. Searching for opportunities where intervention might have changed the outcome. But hindsight creates a clarity that rarely exists in real time. At the time, many of those moments may have appeared isolated. Temporary. Manageable. Only later did they reveal a larger pattern. For Annie, daily life increasingly required balancing multiple emotional realities. She was a mother. A daughter. An immigrant. A wife. Each role carried responsibilities. Each role carried expectations. And each role became more difficult as tensions inside the marriage intensified. Imagine waking up every morning already calculating emotional risks. Imagine considering how a simple conversation might unfold. Imagine wondering whether an ordinary disagreement could become something more. That kind of stress changes people. It settles into the body. Into posture. Into sleep. Into silence. Victims often become experts at concealing emotional pain. They smile when necessary. Attend social gatherings. Continue routines. From the outside, life appears normal. Inside, however, fear is slowly taking root. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of domestic violence is how invisible it can remain. A victim may speak to co-workers every day without revealing what happens at home. They may attend family gatherings while hiding anxiety beneath polite conversation. They may laugh at dinner while carrying fears they cannot safely express. The public rarely sees these hidden battles. Annie's story appears to reflect that reality. By 2007, there were indications she was increasingly concerned about her future. The marriage that once represented stability had become a source of uncertainty. The person who should have been her partner had become someone she reportedly feared. That transformation does not happen overnight. It happens gradually. One difficult moment after another. One compromise after another. One disappointment after another. Until eventually the relationship no longer resembles what it once was. Yet despite these challenges, Annie continued moving forward. Because parents often do. Children create powerful motivation. Even in difficult circumstances, mothers and fathers wake up and continue functioning because someone depends on them. That responsibility becomes a source of strength. And for Annie, her daughter remained the center of everything. There is something particularly cruel about crimes involving domestic violence. The offender already knows the victim. Already understands their routines. Their fears. Their hopes. Their vulnerabilities. The violence emerges not from a stranger entering someone's life. It emerges from someone already occupying a place of trust. That betrayal magnifies the tragedy. In Annie's case, investigators would later argue that the danger came from the person closest to her. The person sharing her home. The person helping raise their daughter. The person who should have protected her. As summer faded into autumn in New Zealand during 2007, Annie's life stood at a crossroads. Though she could not know it, she was entering the final chapter of her story. The future she imagined for herself and her daughter was beginning to slip beyond reach. Yet in those final weeks, she remained what she had always been. A mother trying to create stability. A daughter loved by her family. A woman hoping for a better future. A human being whose life possessed value far beyond the circumstances of her death. That distinction matters. Because true crime sometimes risks reducing victims to the worst thing that happened to them. Annie deserves to be remembered as more than a victim. She was a person before she became a case file. Before detectives examined evidence. Before reporters wrote articles. Before jurors heard testimony. She existed as a daughter who once had childhood dreams. A young woman who believed in possibility. A mother who loved her child. And somewhere during those final days, while she continued trying to navigate the complicated reality of her life, a terrible decision was taking shape elsewhere. A decision that would end her future. A decision that would orphan her daughter. A decision that would trigger an international manhunt spanning 3 countries. But at this point in the story, none of that has happened yet. The world still turns normally. The streets of Auckland remain busy. The family home still stands. The little girl later known as Pumpkin still has both parents. And Annie Liu is still alive. For only a little while longer. September 11, 2007. The date would later become a fixed point in the investigation. A day prosecutors would return to repeatedly. A day detectives would reconstruct minute by minute. A day that began like any other and ended with a life extinguished. The exact atmosphere inside the house that morning can never be known with complete certainty. No cameras recorded every conversation. No witnesses sat quietly in the corner documenting the final hours. The walls of the home kept their secrets. And one of the 2 adults inside would never speak again. But years later, through forensic evidence, witness statements, timelines, and courtroom testimony, investigators would piece together a chilling picture of what most likely occurred. Outside, Auckland continued with its ordinary rhythm. Traffic moved through the city. Children attended school. Store owners unlocked their doors. People worried about appointments, bills, errands, and deadlines. The world remained unaware that a tragedy was unfolding inside a suburban home in Mount Roskill. For Annie Liu, those hours would be her last. At some point during the day, an argument appears to have escalated. The details remain buried within the silence of the house. No one knows the exact words exchanged. No one knows who spoke first. No one knows what emotions filled the room during those final moments. Fear. Anger. Desperation. Control. Perhaps all of them. What investigators would later establish, however, was the outcome. At some stage, Nai Yin Shui used a necktie as a weapon. Not a gun. Not a knife. Not something brought specifically to the scene. A tie. An ordinary object transformed into an instrument of death. That detail carries a particular kind of horror. A necktie is associated with routine, business, professional life, respectability. Yet inside that house, it became something else entirely. Forensic evidence would later indicate that Annie was strangled. The process was not instantaneous. Television often creates the false impression that strangulation causes immediate unconsciousness. Reality is different. Reality is slower, more brutal, more personal. The medical findings suggested the assault lasted long enough to require sustained force. Long enough for intent to become undeniable. Long enough for opportunities to stop. Long enough for choices to be made and remade. When investigators later described the attack, one detail stood out with haunting significance. The pressure had been maintained for approximately 3 minutes. 3 minutes. It sounds brief until someone actually counts it. 3 minutes is enough time to walk across a parking lot. Enough time to prepare a cup of coffee. Enough time to read several pages of a book. Enough time to reconsider. Enough time to stop. Yet the pressure continued. And eventually, Annie Liu died. The violence itself was horrifying. What happened afterward revealed something equally disturbing. Because death did not trigger an emergency call. No ambulance was summoned. No attempt was made to seek help. Instead, investigators would later conclude that a different process began. A process focused not on saving a life but on concealing a crime. Somewhere inside the home, a transition occurred. The role of husband gave way to something colder. Something calculating. Something focused on logistics. A dead body now existed inside the house. And decisions had to be made. The choices that followed would become central to understanding the case. According to the evidence later presented, Annie's body was moved into the trunk of the family's vehicle. The image is difficult to process. A woman whose life had revolved around caring for her daughter. A woman who had slept in that home. Cooked meals there. Made plans there. now hidden inside a confined metal compartment only meters away from the life she once knew. The trunk closed. Darkness. Silence. And beyond that metal barrier, ordinary life continued. Perhaps one of the most unsettling aspects of the crime is what happened next. Days passed. Not hours. Days. The vehicle remained near the family home. The body remained concealed. And during this period, Na Yin-shue did not surrender. He did not report what had happened. He did not contact authorities. Instead, evidence would suggest he was preparing to leave. Preparing not merely to leave the house. Not merely to leave Auckland. But to leave the country. And at the center of those preparations stood a 3-year-old child. Little Chen Zun-shue. The daughter who had no understanding of the catastrophe surrounding her. Children experience time differently than adults. They do not fully grasp permanence. They do not understand criminal investigations. They do not understand death. Their world consists primarily of trust. Parents provide food. Parents provide safety. Parents explain reality. When something frightening happens, children instinctively move toward the adults they depend on. Which makes the events that followed all the more heartbreaking. Because while Annie lay hidden inside the vehicle, her daughter remained under the care of the very person responsible for destroying their family. Imagine that contrast. A mother permanently silenced. A daughter still expecting bedtime stories. Still expecting breakfast. Still expecting tomorrow to resemble yesterday. The gap between those realities is almost impossible to comprehend. As investigators later reconstructed movements and timelines, a disturbing picture emerged. Na Yin-shue appeared focused on escape. The planning did not resemble panic. It resembled intention. Every step moved him farther away from the crime scene. Farther away from accountability. Farther away from New Zealand itself. Yet one question remained. What did he intend to do with his daughter? The answer would shock the world. Because the murder, terrible as it was, represented only part of the story. The abandonment had not happened yet. The international manhunt had not begun. The child known to the world as Pumpkin had not yet entered public consciousness. Those events were still waiting just beyond the horizon. But the foundations were already being laid. A murder had occurred. A body had been hidden. A plan was taking shape. And every hour that passed moved the case closer to a moment that would leave investigators across 3 countries struggling to understand how one man could make the choices he did. In the days following Annie's death, the contrast between appearance and reality became even more striking. To strangers, Na Yin-shue may have appeared to be a father traveling with his child. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. A man and his daughter moving through airports. Waiting in lines. Passing through terminals. Just another family among thousands. But hidden behind that image was a truth nobody around them could see. The child's mother was dead. The body remained undiscovered. And the man holding the little girl's hand was already moving farther away from the scene of a homicide. The journey would soon carry them across the Tasman Sea to Australia. Then beyond. Each mile placing additional distance between the crime and the person responsible. Yet despite all that movement, despite all the planning, despite every attempt to outrun consequences, one reality remained unchanged. Annie Liu was gone. Her future had ended inside a house where she should have been safe. Her daughter no longer had a mother. Her family had no idea what had truly happened. And somewhere in Auckland, hidden within the trunk of a vehicle, the first physical evidence of the crime waited patiently to be discovered. The silence would not last forever. Soon, questions would begin. Family members would become concerned. Authorities would become involved. The carefully constructed illusion would start to crack. But at this moment in the story, the truth remained buried. A dead woman hidden in darkness. A missing mother. A child still clinging to the only parent she had left. And a killer moving steadily toward the next shocking act in a crime that was about to capture international attention. By the time authorities in Australia were trying to identify the little girl known only as Pumpkin, another mystery was beginning to unfold across the Tasman Sea. At first, the two stories appeared unrelated. One involved an abandoned child discovered alone inside one of Australia's busiest transportation hubs. The other involved a woman whose sudden silence was becoming impossible to ignore. But as investigators would soon discover, both mysteries were connected by the same man. And at the center of that connection waited a horrifying discovery. The first signs that something was wrong did not come from forensic evidence. They came from absence. Human beings leave traces of themselves everywhere. Phone calls, messages, appointments, conversations, daily routines. When those traces suddenly stop, people notice. Especially the people who care. For Annie Liu's family, the silence felt unnatural. Days had passed without meaningful contact. Explanations were vague. Information was inconsistent. Questions produced uncertainty rather than answers. The concern grew steadily. Every unanswered call created new anxiety. Every passing day deepened the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Families often describe a moment when worry transforms into fear. A moment when instinct begins overriding logic. When reassurance no longer works. When the heart starts preparing for bad news before the mind is willing to accept it. For Annie's loved ones, that moment had arrived. Meanwhile, authorities were already becoming interested in the whereabouts of Na Yin Shui. The abandoned child in Melbourne had generated public attention. Media coverage expanded rapidly. Photographs circulated. Viewers watched television reports and wondered who the little girl was. Questions multiplied. Where were her parents? Why had she been left alone? Who would abandon a 3-year-old child in a crowded station and simply disappear? At that stage, investigators still lacked the answer. But pieces of the puzzle were slowly moving toward each other. In Auckland, officers began examining the circumstances surrounding Annie's disappearance. Missing adult investigations can be challenging. People leave voluntarily every day. Relationships end. Arguments occur. Individuals sometimes distance themselves from friends and family. Police must distinguish between ordinary absence and genuine danger. The distinction is not always immediately obvious. Yet something about this case felt different. The inconsistencies surrounding Annie's disappearance continued accumulating. And eventually investigators focused their attention on the family home in Mount Roskill. The house stood quietly beneath the New Zealand sky. From the outside, it appeared ordinary. A typical suburban property. Nothing about its appearance hinted at what lay nearby. No flashing lights. No visible signs of violence. No dramatic indication that a homicide investigation was beginning to take shape. That contrast is common in major criminal cases. The most disturbing truths are often hidden in the most familiar places. Investigators arrived carrying questions. They expected to gather information. To establish timelines. To search for clues explaining Annie's disappearance. What they found would transform the case completely. Near the home sat the family's vehicle. At first glance, it was simply another car. Parked. Silent. Unremarkable. Yet investigators understood an important principle. Vehicles are often extensions of crime scenes. They carry fingerprints, fibers, DNA, hidden evidence. Sometimes they carry much more. As attention shifted toward the vehicle, a sense of unease began developing. Something was wrong. Experienced investigators learned to trust certain instincts. Not assumptions. Not guesses. Observations. Small details that refused to fit comfortably into an innocent explanation. The closer authorities moved toward the truth, the heavier the atmosphere became. Then came the moment. The moment that permanently altered the investigation. The trunk was opened. Inside was Annie Liu. The discovery ended one mystery instantly. She was no longer a missing person. But it created another. A far darker one. The woman family members had been desperately trying to locate had been there all along. Only meters away from the place she had lived. Only meters away from familiar rooms. Only meters away from the ordinary life that had ended days earlier. For the officers present, the significance of the discovery became immediately clear. This was no disappearance. This was a homicide investigation. The atmosphere surrounding a crime scene changes the moment a body is found. Possibilities collapse into realities. Hope narrows. Questions become sharper. The focus shifts from finding someone alive to determining how they died and who is responsible. For Annie's family, the news was devastating. There is no gentle way to receive information like that. No preparation sufficient for such a moment. One day a loved one is missing. The next, authorities are explaining that she has been found dead. The emotional distance between those realities is enormous. Shock often arrives before grief. The mind struggles to process what it has heard. People repeat questions. Ask for clarification. Search desperately for details that might somehow change the outcome. But there are moments in life when reality arrives with brutal finality. This was one of them. As forensic teams began their work, the vehicle became a critical source of evidence. Every surface mattered. Every trace mattered. Every observation might help reconstruct the final days of Annie's life. Investigators documented everything carefully. Photographs. Measurements. Physical evidence. The process was methodical. Professional. Yet beneath the procedures existed a sobering truth. A young mother had been murdered. The forensic examination would later reveal injuries consistent with strangulation. The findings supported the emerging theory of what had happened inside the family home. Each new detail strengthened the case. Each new detail narrowed the range of possibilities. And with every discovery, suspicion increasingly centered on the one person who could not be located. Yin Shui. His absence suddenly became far more significant. If this had been an innocent misunderstanding, where was he? If Annie's death had occurred under circumstances requiring explanation, why had he fled? Why was he no longer in New Zealand? Why had he abandoned his daughter? Those questions echoed throughout the investigation. Because the evidence now suggested something chilling. The murder and the abandonment were not separate incidents. They were parts of the same story. Parts of the same sequence of decisions. The body in Auckland. The child in Melbourne. The missing husband. Each element connected to the others. And together they painted a picture that grew darker with every passing day. News of the discovery spread quickly. Media organizations seized upon the developing case. Public interest intensified. The image of Little Pumpkin suddenly carried new emotional weight. People who had followed the story of the abandoned child now learned that her mother had been found dead. The realization was heartbreaking. The lonely child standing beneath the station lights was no longer simply abandoned. She was a child whose mother had been killed. A child unknowingly separated from the person who loved her most. A child who had spent days in the care of her mother's killer. Public sympathy surged. Viewers who had already felt concern now felt outrage. Questions filled newspapers and television broadcasts. How could this happen? Why would a father abandon his daughter? Where had he gone? Could he still be in Australia? Had he already fled elsewhere? Authorities faced mounting pressure to find answers. International cooperation became increasingly important. What had begun as a local investigation was evolving into something much larger. The suspect had crossed borders. Evidence existed in multiple countries. Media coverage extended far beyond New Zealand. The case had become international. Yet despite the growing attention, investigators still faced a critical problem. The primary suspect was gone. No interview. No confession. No opportunity to confront him with the evidence. Only silence. And distance. Somewhere beyond New Zealand's borders, Na Yin Shui was moving through the world while investigators painstakingly reconstructed the devastation left behind. Back in Auckland, however, the evidence remained. The vehicle. The forensic findings. The timeline. The growing body of information pointing toward murder. The discovery of Annie's body had changed everything. Before the trunk opened, authorities were searching for a missing woman. Afterward, they were hunting a fugitive. And that hunt was about to expand across continents. Because while investigators now understood what had happened to Annie Liu, they still did not know where the man responsible had gone. The answer would lead them thousands of miles away. Across airports. Across states. Across international borders. Into one of the most publicized manhunts of that period. But before justice could begin catching up, Na Yin Shui would have a significant head start. And the race to find him was only just beginning. The discovery of Annie Liu's body transformed the case overnight. What had once been a missing person investigation became a homicide inquiry spanning multiple countries. Detectives no longer needed to determine whether a crime had occurred. The evidence resting inside the trunk of the family vehicle had already answered that question. Now they faced a different challenge: finding the man who had vanished. In many murder investigations, detectives begin with a crime scene and work outward. They examine physical evidence, interview witnesses, identify suspects, and slowly narrow the field. This case unfolded in reverse. The prime suspect was obvious almost immediately. The problem was that he was gone. Somewhere beyond New Zealand's borders, Na Yin Shui had disappeared. And every day he remained free complicated the investigation. The international nature of the case created unique difficulties. Law enforcement agencies across multiple jurisdictions had to coordinate information rapidly. Timelines had to be synchronized. Witness statements needed verification. Travel records had to be reviewed. Surveillance opportunities were limited by geography. The investigation became a race against distance. Each hour mattered. Each lead mattered. Each sighting mattered. At first, detectives focused on reconstructing the days following Annie's death. Understanding where Shui had gone required understanding where he had been. Investigators examined travel records, financial activity, communications, immigration information. Every available piece of data became part of a growing timeline. The picture that emerged revealed a man who appeared determined to put as much distance as possible between himself and the crime scene. The route itself was troubling. New Zealand. Australia. Then onward. The movements suggested planning rather than panic. Purpose rather than confusion. And that distinction mattered. Because investigators were not simply trying to prove who committed the crime. They were trying to understand what happened afterward. Why had he taken his daughter to Australia? Why abandon her? Why continue alone? What had been his ultimate objective? The answers remained frustratingly out of reach. Meanwhile, the story continued attracting international attention. The image of Little Pumpkin remained deeply embedded in public consciousness. Viewers had watched her story evolve in real time. First she was an unidentified child. Then she became the daughter of a missing woman. Then she became the daughter of a murder victim. Each revelation made the case more heartbreaking. People saw her photograph and imagined their own children. Their own families. Their own worst fears. Public engagement became one of the investigation's most valuable resources. The media coverage generated awareness on a scale that law enforcement alone could never achieve. Television broadcasts displayed photographs of Na Yin Shui. Newspapers printed his image. Internet forums circulated updates. His face became recognizable across multiple countries. That recognition would eventually prove critical. But at this stage, it also created challenges. The more public a fugitive becomes, the more false leads begin appearing. Reports poured in. People believed they had seen him in airports, restaurants, hotels, shopping centers, bus terminals, gas stations. Some tips appeared promising. Others collapsed immediately under scrutiny. Investigators followed them anyway. Because every possibility had to be explored. That process consumed enormous resources. Teams spent hours verifying information that ultimately led nowhere. A witness confidently identifies a suspect. Surveillance footage is obtained. The individual turns out to be someone else entirely. Then the cycle begins again. Hope. Verification. Disappointment. The rhythm repeated itself throughout the investigation. And while detectives chased leads, another effort unfolded simultaneously. Investigators worked to understand the hidden history of the marriage. The dead cannot testify. But relationships leave evidence behind. Friends remember conversations. Family members remember concerns. Co-workers notice behavioral changes. Past incidents reveal patterns. As detectives spoke with people who knew Annie and Schwer, a more detailed picture began emerging. The image presented publicly by Schwer did not fully align with what some individuals had experienced privately. Accounts described tension, control, fear. Reports surfaced suggesting a history of domestic abuse. Threats. Attempts to dominate. Behavior that appeared increasingly concerning when viewed through the lens of murder. Each interview added another piece to the puzzle. No single statement explained everything. Together, however, they revealed a troubling pattern. Patterns matter in criminal investigations. They help establish motive, intent, context. They demonstrate that violence rarely appears from nowhere. Often it grows from existing dynamics that become increasingly dangerous over time. In Annie's case, investigators began seeing signs that her marriage had been deteriorating long before September 2007. The evidence suggested she had not been living inside a healthy relationship. Instead, she appeared to have been navigating an environment shaped by intimidation and control. That realization deepened the tragedy. Because it suggested the warning signs may have existed long before the fatal attack. As investigators assembled these findings, prosecutors began considering the future trial. Even before an arrest occurred, they understood the importance of documenting every detail. Witness memories fade. Evidence can be challenged. Timelines must be precise. Building a murder case requires patience and preparation. Especially when the suspect remains beyond reach. And Schwer remained beyond reach. Weeks passed. Then months. The fugitive seemed to drift across the United States. Reports placed him in various locations throughout the South. Tracking him proved difficult. He moved frequently. Lived quietly. Avoided attention. At times, investigators appeared tantalizingly close. Then the trail cooled. Then another lead emerged. Then another dead end followed. The uncertainty frustrated everyone involved. Police. Prosecutors. Journalists. Most importantly, Annie's family. For them, every day without an arrest prolonged the nightmare. Grief itself is difficult enough. Grief combined with uncertainty becomes something even heavier. There was no courtroom. No conviction. No final chapter. Only waiting. Waiting for justice to catch up. Waiting for news. Waiting for answers. Meanwhile, Little Pumpkin's future remained another pressing concern. Authorities worked to ensure her safety and well-being. Unlike investigators, she did not spend her days thinking about suspects or evidence. She was a child. A child who had lost her mother. A child abandoned by her father. A child thrust into international headlines without understanding why. The contrast between the investigation and her reality was striking. Detectives chased fugitives. Reporters chased stories. Governments coordinated legal procedures. And at the center of it all sat a small child trying to navigate a world that had suddenly become unfamiliar. The emotional weight of the case continued fueling public interest. People wanted resolution. Not merely because a murder had occurred, but because the circumstances felt especially cruel. A mother murdered. A child abandoned. An international escape. The story contained elements that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. How could someone commit such acts and simply disappear? That question haunted the investigation. Yet the answer remained elusive. By late 2007 and early 2008, the search had entered a difficult phase. The initial burst of attention had passed. The easy leads were exhausted. Investigators relied increasingly on persistence, patience, methodical work. Many major fugitive cases reach this point. The public assumes progress has stopped. In reality, detectives continue building pressure quietly behind the scenes. Databases are checked. Tips are reviewed. International partners exchange information. The search continues even when headlines fade. That persistence would prove crucial. Because somewhere in the United States, Na Yin Xue was still moving through daily life. He could change locations. He could alter his appearance. He could avoid cameras. But he could not erase his face from public memory. Thousands of people had seen it. Thousands more would continue seeing it. The widespread publicity had created an invisible network of potential witnesses stretching across continents. And eventually, someone within that network would recognize him. Not a detective. Not a federal agent. Not an investigator. Ordinary people. People who happened to see a familiar face and remember where they had seen it before. The breakthrough had not happened yet. But the conditions for it were already forming. While detectives continued sorting through false leads and dead ends, fate was quietly moving events toward a decisive moment. A moment that would end months of uncertainty. A moment that would finally place the fugitive back within reach of justice. Until then, however, the investigation remained suspended between frustration and hope. The evidence against Xue continued growing. The picture of Annie's final days continued becoming clearer. The motive appeared increasingly understandable. Yet the most important piece was still missing. The suspect himself. And until he was found, the story remained unfinished. The hunt continued. Across cities. Across states. Across borders. With investigators refusing to stop. And with a fugitive who likely believed distance could protect him from the consequences waiting on the other side of the world. By early 2008, the investigation had entered a strange and frustrating phase. The evidence was there. The victim had been identified. The timeline had largely been reconstructed. The suspected killer was known to authorities around the world. Yet the most important question remained unanswered. Where was Na Yin Xue? Months had passed since Annie Liu's body had been discovered inside the trunk of the family vehicle. Months had passed since Little Pumpkin had been found alone in Melbourne. Months had passed since the suspect had vanished into the vast geography of the United States. For detectives working the case, the passage of time created both pressure and concern. Every day without an arrest increased the possibility that evidence could be lost. Witnesses could forget details. Trails could grow cold. A fugitive could establish a new identity. The longer someone remains free, the harder it often becomes to find them. Yet despite those challenges, investigators refused to let the case disappear. International law enforcement agencies continued sharing intelligence. Photographs circulated. Tips were analyzed. Possible sightings were reviewed. The search remained active even when public attention began shifting toward newer headlines. What nobody knew was that the breakthrough would arrive from an unexpected direction. Not from sophisticated surveillance. Not from advanced forensic technology. Not from a dramatic undercover operation. It would come from ordinary people paying attention. The kind of people who watch the news. The kind of people who remember faces. The kind of people who decide that something seems wrong and choose to act. That possibility is one of the most fascinating aspects of major manhunts. Fugitives often imagine they are hiding from police. In reality, they are hiding from society itself. Every cashier, every customer, every neighbor, every stranger becomes a potential witness. The more publicized a case becomes, the smaller the world feels for the person on the run. Somewhere during those months, Na Yin Shui appears to have been moving through communities without attracting significant attention. At least initially. He had crossed continents. He had traveled thousands of miles from the crime scene. The Pacific Ocean separated him from Auckland. The distance may have provided a sense of security. A feeling that the investigation was happening somewhere far away. Somewhere disconnected from his daily existence. But distance has limits. Especially in an age of international media coverage. Especially when photographs are everywhere. Especially when an entire case has captured public imagination. The image of Pumpkin had become unforgettable. The image of Annie's smiling face had become unforgettable. And alongside them, the image of Na Yin Shui had become equally recognizable. The story had reached newspapers, television stations, internet websites, community organizations. People remembered. And memory would ultimately become his enemy. The decisive moment arrived on February 28, 2008. More than 5 months after Annie's body had been discovered. More than 5 months after authorities had begun searching for him. The location was Chambly, Georgia. A city located just northeast of Atlanta. By all appearances, it was an ordinary day. People moved through their routines. Businesses operated normally. Cars traveled familiar roads. Nobody waking up that morning could have predicted that one of the world's most wanted fugitives would soon be identified. The breakthrough began with recognition. Simple recognition. The kind that starts with uncertainty. A face seems familiar. A memory surfaces. Someone pauses. Looks again. Tries to remember where they have seen that person before. Most people experience that sensation regularly. Usually it means nothing. A former classmate. A coworker. A neighbor from years ago. But sometimes the memory connects to something much larger. In this case, it connected to an international manhunt. Members of the local Chinese community reportedly recognized the man they were seeing. The face matched photographs that had appeared repeatedly in news coverage. The resemblance was too strong to ignore. The longer they looked, the more convinced they became. This was not merely someone who looked similar. This was Na Yin Shui. The fugitive authorities had been searching for across multiple countries. Imagine the realization. One moment you are going about an ordinary day. The next, you believe you are standing near the subject of an international murder investigation. The emotional shift would have been immediate. Shock. Disbelief. Urgency. Perhaps even fear. Recognition alone, however, was not enough. Action had to follow. And action did follow. The individuals involved understood the significance of what they were witnessing. Instead of dismissing their suspicions, they intervened. The details remain remarkable even today. Rather than allowing the suspected fugitive to disappear once again, they reportedly confronted him and prevented his escape until law enforcement arrived. Months of searching ended in a matter of moments. The international manhunt was over. The man who had crossed oceans attempting to avoid accountability had finally run out of road. For investigators in New Zealand, the news represented a breakthrough they had been waiting months to receive. The arrest transformed the entire trajectory of the case. Up until that point, everything had been preparation. Evidence gathering. Witness interviews. Forensic analysis. Timeline reconstruction. Now the suspect was finally in custody. Now prosecutors could begin focusing on the courtroom. Now justice felt possible. The arrest also generated international media attention. News organizations quickly reported the development. The story that had begun with an abandoned child and a missing mother now had a major turning point. For many members of the public, the capture brought relief. Not closure. Closure is a complicated word. Especially in homicide cases. An arrest cannot bring someone back. It cannot erase trauma. It cannot restore a lost future. But it can provide accountability. And accountability matters. For Annie's family, The capture meant the person suspected of taking her life would no longer remain beyond reach. For investigators, it validated months of effort. For the public, it reaffirmed an important truth. Fugitives can run. Sometimes they run for years. Sometimes they cross borders. Sometimes they travel across oceans. But escape and freedom are not the same thing. Na Yin Shui had succeeded in creating distance. He had failed to create invisibility. After the arrest, legal procedures began unfolding. International cases are rarely simple. Extradition and deportation processes involve multiple jurisdictions and layers of bureaucracy. Documentation must be completed. Requests must be reviewed. Agreements must be honored. The process can take time. Yet compared to the uncertainty that had defined the previous months, these were challenges investigators welcomed. Because they knew where the suspect was. They knew he could not simply vanish again. That certainty changed everything. Meanwhile, detectives continued refining the case. With the suspect located, attention increasingly shifted toward preparing for trial. Evidence was organized. Witnesses were identified. Statements were reviewed. Every aspect of the investigation underwent careful examination. The goal was no longer merely to locate a fugitive. The goal was to prove murder beyond reasonable doubt. That distinction is important. Finding a suspect and convicting a suspect are entirely different tasks. The first requires investigation. The second requires proof. And prosecutors understood they would need to explain not only what happened but why the evidence supported their conclusions. As preparations continued, another aspect of the story remained deeply emotional. Pumpkin. The little girl whose photograph had once appeared across television screens. By now, she had become more than a symbol. She represented the human cost of the crime. Every major development in the investigation inevitably brought public attention back to her. The child who had waited alone in a train station. The child whose mother was dead. The child abandoned by her father. The child whose life had been permanently altered by decisions she could not possibly understand. In many ways, she embodied the tragedy more completely than any piece of evidence ever could. Because criminal investigations often focus on facts. Dates. Locations. Forensic findings. Yet behind every fact stands a human consequence. And Pumpkin was living proof of those consequences. As the legal process moved forward, anticipation grew. A trial was coming. Questions that had lingered for months would eventually be examined in court. Witnesses would speak. Evidence would be presented. Arguments would be challenged. The narrative would move from investigation to judgment. But before that could happen, one final reality had become clear. The man who believed he could outrun the consequences of September 2007 was now heading back toward them. The distance between Georgia and Auckland was enormous. The distance between arrest and accountability was much smaller. The breakthrough had finally arrived. The fugitive had been found. The hunt was over. And for the first time since Annie Liu's death, justice was no longer chasing Na Yin Shui. Justice was waiting for him. When Na Yin Shui was finally returned to New Zealand, the investigation entered its final and most public phase. For nearly 2 years, detectives had assembled evidence piece by piece. For nearly 2 years, Annie Liu's family had carried grief while waiting for answers. For nearly 2 years, the story had traveled across newspapers, television broadcasts, and international headlines. Now the focus shifted to a courtroom. The place where facts would be examined. The place where competing narratives would collide. The place where the final chapter of the legal battle would unfold. Courtrooms possess a unique atmosphere. Unlike the urgency of a crime scene or the unpredictability of a manhunt, they move according to procedure. Every statement is recorded. Every piece of evidence is scrutinized. Every argument is challenged. The pace is slower, more deliberate. Yet beneath that controlled environment often lies enormous emotional weight. Especially in homicide trials. Because behind every exhibit and every testimony stands a human life that cannot be restored. For Annie Liu's family, entering the courtroom meant confronting painful realities repeatedly. Photographs would be shown. Events would be reconstructed. Details they desperately wished had never existed would become subjects of public discussion. That burden falls on many families seeking justice. To pursue accountability, they must relive the trauma. Again and again. The trial began in 2009. By then, investigators had spent months preparing. Prosecutors believed the evidence painted a clear picture of what had happened. Their task was to present that picture to the jury. Methodically. Persuasively. Without leaving room for reasonable doubt. The prosecution's case extended beyond the final act of violence. It reached backward into the history of the marriage itself. Because murders rarely occur in isolation. They emerge from contexts, relationships, patterns, motives. Understanding those elements helps explain why a crime occurred. Witnesses described concerns that had existed before Annie's death. Accounts emerged regarding controlling behavior, threats, domestic abuse, patterns of intimidation. The prosecution argued that these details were not unrelated background information. They were warning signs. Evidence of a relationship marked by fear and power imbalance. The portrait that emerged was deeply troubling. It suggested a marriage that had become increasingly toxic, increasingly dangerous, increasingly unsustainable. As testimony unfolded, jurors were asked to consider not merely a single day in September 2007 but the larger story surrounding it. A story of escalating control. A story of deteriorating relationships. A story ending in violence. The forensic evidence played a critical role. Medical findings supported the conclusion that Annie had been strangled. The injuries were consistent with sustained force. The conclusions reached by experts aligned with the prosecution's theory of the crime. Physical evidence often carries particular weight in murder trials. Witnesses can forget. Memories can change. Opinions can differ. But forensic findings provide an objective foundation. In this case, they helped establish how Annie died. And the evidence did not stop there. Investigators presented details surrounding the concealment of the body. The decision to place Annie inside the trunk of the family vehicle. The failure to seek help. The subsequent flight from New Zealand. The abandonment of Pumpkin in Australia. The journey to the United States. Each step became part of a larger argument. The prosecution contended that these actions reflected consciousness of guilt. Not confusion. Not panic. Not accident. Guilt. The sequence mattered. Because jurors were not examining isolated incidents. They were examining behavior. And behavior often reveals intention. The defense, meanwhile, sought to challenge aspects of the prosecution's interpretation. As in any criminal trial, their role involved testing the evidence and raising questions. The adversarial process exists for a reason. The burden of proof belongs to the prosecution. A conviction requires more than suspicion. It requires certainty beyond reasonable doubt. The courtroom therefore became a battleground of competing explanations. Yet as the trial progressed, the cumulative weight of the evidence continued building. Witness after witness. Exhibit after exhibit. Detail after detail. Each contributing to the same overarching narrative. For Annie's family, sitting through those proceedings could not have been easy. Every testimony represented another reminder of loss. Every photograph represented another glimpse into a future that had been stolen. Families often describe homicide trials as emotionally exhausting. Justice requires participation. Participation requires endurance. And endurance requires revisiting wounds that have barely begun to heal. The jury carried its own responsibility. Unlike investigators, they had not spent years immersed in the case. Unlike family members, they had no personal connection to the victim. Their duty was to listen carefully, evaluate evidence objectively, Apply the law. Reach a conclusion. The process demanded concentration and discipline. Because the consequences would be enormous. One decision. One verdict. A determination that would affect multiple lives forever. Outside the courtroom, public interest remained significant. The case had already become one of the most widely discussed criminal investigations in recent New Zealand history. Many people followed developments closely. The circumstances were simply too extraordinary to ignore. A murdered mother. A child abandoned in another country. An international fugitive. A global manhunt. The elements combined into a case that seemed almost cinematic. Yet beneath the headlines remained a painful truth. This was not entertainment. This was a real family. A real loss. A real child growing up without her mother. That reality often hovered over the proceedings. The legal arguments mattered. The evidence mattered. But ultimately the trial centered on a human life that had ended violently. As the presentation of evidence concluded, attention shifted toward the jury. The moment every trial eventually reaches. The point where lawyers stop speaking and jurors begin deciding. The waiting can be agonizing. 4 prosecutors. 4 defense attorneys. 4 families. 4 defendants. No one can predict with certainty what will happen once deliberations begin. The outcome remains locked behind closed doors until a verdict is reached. Then came the decision. On June 20, 2009, the jury found Nai Yin Shwe guilty of murder. After years of investigation. After months of preparation. After weeks of testimony. The legal question had been answered. The courtroom finally possessed a conclusion. The verdict brought a measure of relief to those who had waited so long for accountability. Not happiness. There is no happiness in a murder verdict. Only recognition. Recognition that responsibility has been established. Recognition that the evidence has been accepted. Recognition that the legal system has reached its judgment. For Annie's family, the verdict represented an important milestone. Not because it erased grief. Nothing could do that. Not because it restored the future Annie should have had. Nothing could do that either. But because it affirmed that her death mattered. That her life mattered. That what happened to her would not simply disappear into silence. Sentencing followed. The court imposed life imprisonment. Additionally, Nai Yin Shwe would be required to serve a minimum non-parole period before becoming eligible for consideration. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the crime and the circumstances surrounding it. A life had been taken. A child had been orphaned. The consequences extended far beyond a single act of violence. As the proceedings concluded, many observers reflected on the extraordinary path that had brought the case to that moment. The journey from a suburban home in Auckland to a train station in Melbourne to communities in the United States and finally back to a New Zealand courtroom. The geographic distance had been immense. The emotional distance even greater. Years later, another notable development would occur. For a long time, Nai Yin Shwe maintained his denials regarding responsibility for Annie's death. But during a parole hearing in 2020, he reportedly acknowledged that he had killed her and expressed remorse. The admission arrived more than a decade after the conviction. For some observers, it represented a long-delayed acceptance of responsibility. For others, it changed little. The verdict had already been delivered years earlier. The facts had already been established. The damage had already been done. Apologies arriving after such devastation occupy a complicated place. Some families welcome them. Others find them insufficient. Many experience a mixture of emotions difficult to describe. What remains undeniable is that no expression of regret can reverse the consequences. Annie Liu remained gone. Pumpkin still grew up without her mother. A family still carried the scars left behind by violence. The courtroom had delivered justice in the legal sense. The guilty party had been convicted. The sentence had been imposed. The case had reached its judicial conclusion. Yet as with many homicide cases, Legal closure and emotional closure were not the same thing. The law had spoken. The verdict was final. But the human story would continue long after the courtroom lights dimmed and the final documents were filed away. Because justice can punish wrongdoing. It can establish accountability. It can acknowledge truth. What it cannot do is restore the life that was taken. And that reality would remain at the heart of this case forever. Long after the cameras left, the story continued. That is something true crime rarely shows. Headlines end. Trials conclude. News broadcasts move on to the next story. But for the people living inside the aftermath, there is no final episode. There is no closing credit sequence. There is only life after tragedy. And sometimes that is the hardest chapter of all. When people remember the Schwer family case today, they often recall the most dramatic images. The abandoned child standing alone in Melbourne. The discovery of Annie Liu's body inside the trunk of a vehicle. The international manhunt stretching across continents. The arrest in Georgia. The murder trial. Those moments dominate public memory because they are dramatic. They are visual. They fit neatly into the structure of a crime story. Yet beyond those moments exists something quieter. Something more human. The aftermath. The years that followed. The lives that had to continue. At the center of that aftermath stood a little girl. The child once known to the world only as Pumpkin. There is something particularly heartbreaking about the way children experience tragedy. Adults understand loss through context. They understand death. They understand betrayal. They understand permanence. Children often do not. At least not immediately. For a child, loss arrives in fragments. A familiar voice disappears. A routine changes. A parent stops coming home. Questions emerge long before answers make sense. The emotional impact unfolds gradually across years. Sometimes decades. As Pumpkin grew older, she would eventually learn details about her story that she could not possibly understand at 3 years old. She would learn about the mother she lost. She would learn about the father who abandoned her. She would learn that the photographs, newspaper articles, and television reports were all connected to her own life. Imagine carrying that knowledge. Imagine discovering that one of the most publicized stories of your childhood was not merely something you watched. It was something you lived. Fortunately, Pumpkin was not left completely alone. Following the events of 2007, custody arrangements ultimately placed her with her maternal family. She was reunited with relatives who could provide the stability and care that had been violently disrupted. That fact matters. Because stories involving violence often contain small acts of resilience. Small acts of love. People stepping forward to protect what remains. Family members choosing responsibility despite grief. Those choices do not erase tragedy. But they help prevent tragedy from claiming even more victims. For Annie's family, raising Pumpkin meant carrying 2 responsibilities simultaneously. Protecting a child. And preserving the memory of a mother. Both tasks required extraordinary strength. Every birthday likely carried complicated emotions. Every milestone. Every school achievement. Every step toward adulthood. Moments of pride mixed with reminders of absence. The people we lose continue existing in unexpected ways. In stories. In memories. In family photographs. In mannerisms inherited by children. In habits repeated without conscious thought. Annie's future was stolen from her. But her influence did not disappear. It remained present in the daughter she loved. Perhaps that is one of the most powerful forms of human persistence. The continuation of love beyond death. The continuation of memory despite violence. The continuation of family despite loss. Meanwhile, the legal chapter of the case appeared settled. The conviction stood. The sentence remained in place. The justice system had reached its conclusion. Yet criminal cases often leave behind larger questions that extend beyond individual guilt. Questions about warning signs. Questions about domestic violence. Questions about intervention. Questions about the moments before tragedy. One of the most uncomfortable truths revealed by many domestic homicide cases is that warning signs frequently exist long before the final act of violence. Sometimes friends notice them. Sometimes relatives notice them. Sometimes victims themselves recognize the danger. But recognition alone does not always create safety. Leaving dangerous relationships can be extraordinarily difficult. Emotional ties. Financial dependence. Children. Fear. Cultural expectations. Threats. All of these factors can trap victims in circumstances outsiders struggle to understand. The Schwer family case serves as a painful reminder of that reality. Domestic violence is rarely confined to a single incident. It often develops through patterns of control, patterns of intimidation, patterns that gradually become normalized inside the relationship. By the time outsiders recognize the danger, significant harm may already have occurred. That does not mean intervention is pointless. Quite the opposite. It means awareness matters. Listening matters. Taking concerns seriously matters. Because sometimes the difference between safety and tragedy lies in whether someone believes a victim when they speak about fear. Another lasting lesson from this case involves the extraordinary cooperation required to achieve justice. The crime began in New Zealand. The child was found in Australia. The fugitive was located in the United States. 3 countries. Multiple agencies. Different legal systems. Different jurisdictions. Yet ultimately they worked toward the same objective. Finding the truth. In an increasingly interconnected world, criminal investigations often extend beyond national borders. The Schwer family case became a striking example of what international cooperation can accomplish. No single agency solved the case alone. No single country carried the entire burden. Instead, investigators, officials, and ordinary citizens collectively contributed to the outcome. Even the arrest itself reflected that reality. Months of investigative work culminated in ordinary people recognizing a face and refusing to ignore what they saw. There is something profoundly human about that. Justice is often portrayed as the work of courts and police. And certainly they play essential roles. But communities matter too. Awareness matters. Responsibility matters. The decision of a single person to act rather than remain silent can alter the course of an entire case. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this story, however, remains the contrast between its beginning and its end. At the beginning there was a family. A mother. A father. A daughter. The ordinary components of countless households. Nothing about that picture automatically predicted catastrophe. And yet beneath the surface, destructive forces were already growing. Control. Anger. Violence. Choices. One decision led to another. Then another. Until eventually an entire future collapsed. That progression is worth remembering because major tragedies rarely emerge fully formed. They develop. They escalate. They evolve. Understanding that process may be uncomfortable. But it is necessary. Because prevention begins with recognition. Recognition of patterns. Recognition of danger. Recognition of behaviors that should never be dismissed as normal. Years after the conviction, one detail continues to resonate more strongly than almost any other. The image of Pumpkin standing alone. Not because it was the beginning of the story. In reality, it came near the end. But because it captured the human cost of everything that came before. A small child waiting in a crowded station. Trusting that a parent would return. Unaware that her mother was already gone. Unaware that her father had chosen to walk away. Unaware that the world was about to learn her face. That image strips away legal arguments. It strips away media coverage. It strips away courtroom procedures. What remains is something simple. A child. And the consequences of adult decisions. Perhaps that is why the case continues to resonate so deeply. Not because of the international manhunt. Not because of the dramatic headlines. But because beneath every extraordinary detail lies a profoundly human tragedy. A woman lost her life. A child lost her parents. A family lost someone they loved. And no verdict, no prison sentence, and no passage of time can completely erase those facts. In the end, Annie Liu's story is not merely a story about murder. It is a story about vulnerability, about control, about the hidden dangers that can exist behind closed doors. It is a story about the resilience of surviving family members, about a child who endured circumstances no child should ever face, and about the importance of recognizing warning signs before they become headlines. As we close this chapter, it is worth remembering Annie not for the way her life ended, but for the life she lived. A daughter. A mother. A woman who carried hopes for the future. A person whose value cannot be measured by the tragedy that took her away. And perhaps that is where every true crime story should ultimately arrive. Not at the killer. Not at the crime scene. Not even at the verdict. But at the people left behind. The lives that mattered before violence entered the picture. The memories worth preserving. The lessons worth learning. And the quiet hope that by remembering stories like this, fewer families may someday be forced to live them. The case is closed. The sentence has been delivered. The headlines have faded. But the echoes remain. And they remind us that behind every case file is a human story that deserves to be remembered with dignity, compassion, and truth.